Welcome to this journey of one of the most disturbing cases in recorded history of the Ozark Plateau. Before we begin, I invite you to leave a comment about where you're watching from and the exact time you heard this story. We're interested in knowing where and at what times of day or night these documented accounts arrive. The fog hung thick over Jenkins County in the autumn of 1865. War had ended elsewhere, but in the remote hills of the Ozark Plateau, a different kind of darkness persisted. County records from that year mention, almost as a footnote, the disappearance of one Ruthie Mae Dunlap, age 29, from her homestead near Blackwell Creek. What makes this case particularly unsettling isn't the disappearance itself. The war had displaced countless souls, but rather the circumstances that preceded it and the discoveries made decades later that cast a shadow over the entire community's history. The Dunlap homestead sat approximately 3 miles northwest of what was then the small settlement of Howells Junction. According to land deeds filed in 1860, the property encompassed some 40 acres of mostly wooded land, with a modest clearing where the main house and barn stood. Local accounts describe it as remote even by Ozark standards, accessible only by a narrow dirt path that became nearly impassable during the rainy seasons. The house itself, according to tax assessments, was a substantial 2-story structure built of local stone and timber, unusually well constructed for a solitary occupant in such a remote location. Ruthie Mae was not a native of the region. Records indicate she arrived from Tennessee sometime in 1861, just as the war was beginning. Several documents suggest she purchased the property using funds inherited from a deceased relative, though curiously, later investigations revealed discrepancies in the transaction records. The original deed, examined in 1887 by county officials, showed evidence of alteration, with the seller's name appearing to have been changed. What's certain is that she lived alone, an unusual arrangement for a woman in that era and location. The few surviving accounts of Ruthie Mae describe her as tall and severe in appearance, with a manner both proper and distant. She kept to herself, making monthly trips into town for supplies, but otherwise avoiding social gatherings and church services. This behavior naturally bred suspicion among the locals, many of whom, according to a journal kept by the town's general store owner, Elias Parker, wondered what business a solitary woman had in such isolation. Parker's journal, discovered among his effects after his death in 1882, contains several entries regarding Ruthie Mae, noting her peculiar purchasing habits, large quantities of salt, unusual glassware, and chemicals typically used in photography or embalming. What we know of Ruthie Mae's daily life comes primarily from fragmentary sources, receipts from Parker's general store, occasional mentions in letters between townspeople, and most significantly, a partial ledger found among her belongings years later. This ledger, written in a meticulous hand, documented various specimens of local flora she had collected and cataloged, suggesting an interest in botany that was unusually scientific for the time and place. The entries reveal a systematic approach to classification and experimentation, with detailed observations on preservation techniques for various plant materials. Margin notes reference texts that, when later identified, proved to be advanced scientific works not commonly available in America at that time. Another source of information comes from Luther Holcomb, who delivered mail to the outlying areas around Howells Junction. In a statement given to a local newspaper in 1890, when interest in the case had revived, Holcomb recalled delivering occasional packages to Ruthie Mae from various scientific supply houses in St. Louis and even as far away as Philadelphia. He remembered being struck by the weight of these packages and their careful packaging. She always seemed most anxious about those deliveries, he recalled, more so than any letter or news from back east. Holcomb also noted that, in the months before her disappearance, these packages increased in frequency and size. The Dunlap property itself was arranged in a manner that further fueled local suspicion. Visitors, the few who were ever invited, reported that the main house contained rooms that Ruthie Mae kept locked at all times. The barn had been converted into what she referred to as her workshop, and no one was permitted to enter it under any circumstances. According to Tobias Green, a carpenter who was hired to repair the roof in the spring of 1864, the windows of the barn had been covered over with thick canvas, preventing anyone from seeing inside. Green also reported hearing a steady dripping sound, like water falling into multiple containers, coming from within. In the months preceding her disappearance, several unusual events were noted in the community. Livestock went missing from neighboring farms, primarily pigs and goats, according to complaints filed with the sheriff's office. Strange sounds were reported emanating from the direction of the Dunlap property at night, described variously as mechanical grinding and unearthly wailing. Most notably, 3 separate hunters reported seeing smoke rising from the Dunlap chimney at odd hours, thick and acrid, unlike normal wood smoke, according to a statement given to the county sheriff in August of 1865. One hunter, Edmund Faulkner, claimed to have seen unusual lights moving through the woods near the Dunlap property, like lanterns carried by multiple persons, though to my knowledge Miss Dunlap lived alone. The local physician, Dr. Samuel Warren, noted in his personal correspondence that Ruthie Mae had approached him in September 1865 with questions about human anatomy that he found unsettlingly specific and advanced. In a letter to a colleague in St. Louis dated September 28, 1865, Warren wrote, "The woman's inquiries suggested a knowledge of physiological matters one would expect only from a trained medical professional. She was particularly interested in the preservation of tissue and the circulation of fluids through the body after death. I provided what information I deemed appropriate, but must confess to a certain disquiet regarding her intentions." On October 17, 1865, Ruthie Mae made what would be her final visit to Howell's Junction. Multiple witnesses recalled her purchasing an unusual quantity of supplies, enough to last through winter, though it was still early autumn. The proprietor of the town's small apothecary noted in his records that she also requested several uncommon chemical compounds, which he could not provide. When asked about their purpose, she reportedly replied that they were for preservation. The apothecary, Jacob Stern, later told investigators that her manner that day seemed altered, a feverish intensity about her eyes, and her hands trembled with what I took to be excitement rather than illness. Clementine Foster, who worked at the dry goods store, reported that Ruthie Mae purchased several bolts of canvas and a large quantity of heavy cord that day. When I commented on the amount, Foster stated in 1887, she told me she was preparing a special container that needed to be thoroughly sealed. She spoke with such strange enthusiasm that it quite unnerved me. She was seen leaving town before noon, her wagon loaded with supplies. This was the last confirmed sighting of Ruthie Mae Dunlap. 3 days later, when a delivery man attempted to bring a package to her homestead, he found the property apparently abandoned. The door to the main house stood open, despite the chill autumn air. Inside, according to his later testimony, everything appeared to be in order. No signs of struggle or hasty departure. A half-eaten meal remained on the table, and the hearth fire had burned down to cold ashes. The delivery man, Joseph Miller, reported his findings to the town sheriff upon his return. His statement, preserved in county records, describes an atmosphere of unnatural stillness about the property. The usual sounds of the woods seemed absent, he noted, as if even the birds and insects had abandoned the area. Miller also reported that the door to the barn was ajar, but that he did not enter, being overcome with a sense of dread as he approached it. Local authorities conducted a perfunctory search of the surrounding woods, but with resources stretched thin in the aftermath of war, and with Ruthie Mae being something of an outsider, the investigation was brief and inconclusive. The prevailing theory recorded in the sheriff's report was that she had simply moved on to more promising territory, a common enough occurrence in those uncertain times. However, the report does note the sheriff's puzzlement at the abandonment of valuable personal possessions and the fully stocked larder, unusual for someone planning to relocate. A small detail mentioned only in the sheriff's private notebook and not in the official report indicates that during the search they discovered a freshly dug pit behind the barn, approximately 6 feet in diameter and 8 feet deep. The pit was empty but lined with a mixture of clay and what appeared to be lime. No explanation for this feature was apparent, and it was not investigated further at the time. The Dunlap property remained abandoned. Within a year, nature began to reclaim the clearing. By 1870, according to county tax records, the property had reverted to the county due to unpaid taxes, though no efforts were made to sell it. Local folklore suggests that nobody wanted the land, that it had somehow become tainted in the minds of the community. A letter from the county commissioner to the state government, dated 1871, requests permission to designate the property as unsuitable for habitation due to unstable ground conditions, though geological surveys of the region show no such hazards in that area. Throughout the 1870s, locals reportedly avoided the area entirely. Hunters claimed that game animals would not enter the vicinity of the former Dunlap homestead, and that vegetation near the house and barn had taken on an unwholesome appearance. One account, published in a regional newspaper in 1876 as part of a collection of local legends, described how a group of young men, on a dare, spent a night near the abandoned property and reported hearing the sounds of glass clinking against glass as if someone were arranging bottles in the darkness. The case might have remained nothing more than a minor historical footnote, one of countless disappearances in the tumultuous post-war period, if not for the drought of 1887. That summer, water levels throughout the Ozarks fell dramatically. Blackwell Creek, which ran along the edge of the former Dunlap property, dried up almost entirely. It was then that a local hunter, tracking a wounded deer, made a discovery that would revive interest in the long-forgotten Ruthie Mae. In the dried creek bed, partially exposed by the receding waters, he found what appeared to be a man-made structure, a small chamber constructed of stone and sealed with what laboratory analysis would later identify as an unusual mortar mixture containing both clay and chemical preservatives not commonly available in the region at that time. Breaking open this chamber, the hunter discovered a collection of glass jars, each meticulously labeled and containing various preserved specimens. The hunter, William Bradshaw, later described his discovery in a signed affidavit. The stone box was that well made it might have lasted 100 years more if the water hadn't exposed it. Inside were 12 glass jars of various sizes, each stopped with a wax seal and labeled in a neat hand. The labels bore numbers and dates, but no indication of the contents. Bradshaw admitted to breaking one of the jars out of curiosity. The contents, he stated, appeared to be some manner of tissue preserved in a clear fluid, neither plant nor animal to my knowledge, but something I cannot rightly describe. Authorities were notified, and a more thorough investigation began. The specimens were sent to a university in St. Louis for analysis. The resulting report, filed in November 1887, described them as anatomical samples of indeterminate origin, preserved through an advanced method not currently documented in scientific literature. More alarmingly, the report noted that the preservation technique appeared to have been experimental, with different chemical formulations used in different containers, suggesting a systematic approach to developing an optimal preservation medium. The report contained a curious addendum, stating that one of the laboratory assistants involved in the analysis had suffered an adverse reaction after prolonged exposure to the specimens, developing skin lesions and reporting unusual sensory phenomena. The assistant reportedly resigned his position shortly thereafter. The university's records show that he was subsequently admitted to a sanitarium in Illinois, where he died 3 months later of what was described as a wasting condition of unknown etiology. This discovery prompted a more thorough search of the Dunlap property and surrounding areas. What they found beneath the collapsed ruins of the main house has been the subject of much speculation and dispute. Official records are notably vague, referring only to additional materials of scientific interest and evidence of experimentation. Several of the investigators reportedly refused to discuss what they had seen, and one is said to have abandoned his position shortly afterward. However, unofficial accounts collected by local historian Martha Greaves in the early 1900s paint a more disturbing picture. According to these testimonies, the searchers discovered a hidden cellar beneath the house, accessible through a concealed trapdoor. The cellar had been specially constructed with stone walls lined with copper sheeting, an expensive and unusual building technique for the time and place. Inside were found more preservation jars, laboratory equipment of advanced design, and notebooks filled with diagrams and formulations. Most disturbing were the accounts of a stone table in the center of the cellar, equipped with restraints and drainage channels that fed into collection vessels. The table bore stains of an unidentifiable nature that had permeated the stone itself. Nearby was found a set of surgical instruments that, according to one witness, showed evidence of extensive use. A journal was recovered from a hidden compartment beneath the floorboards of what had been Ruthie Mae's bedroom. This document, only partially legible after years of exposure to the elements, contained entries dating from 1861 to 1865. The contents revealed that Ruthie Mae Dunlap was not merely a reclusive woman with an interest in botany, but rather a person with formal scientific training, possibly acquired in Europe, though the details remain unclear. The journal entries describe a systematic research program focused on what she referred to as the preservation of vital essence. Initial entries discuss experiments with plant materials, but later passages make oblique references to more complex organic subjects and the necessity of isolation for work of such a sensitive nature. The final readable entry, dated October 15, 1865, just 2 days before her last visit to town, contains the cryptic statement, "Breakthrough achieved." The final phase requires complete immersion. I believe I have overcome the fundamental barrier. Other passages from the journal, as quoted in the 1887 investigation report, reveal Ruthie Mae's scientific philosophy. Preservation is not merely the suspension of decay, but the continuation of existence in an altered state. The boundary between life and death is not a barrier, but a permeable membrane. Through proper chemical intervention, this membrane may be traversed in both directions. Perhaps most unsettling were references to what she called the amalgamation process, described as the introduction of the preservative medium not merely around, but throughout the subject, replacing vital fluids while maintaining structural integrity. Later entries suggest she had progressed from theoretical work to practical application, noting, Subject A shows remarkable retention of tissue, elasticity after 3 months. The eyes remain particularly responsive to light stimulus, suggesting persistent nervous activity. What happened to Ruthie Mae Dunlap? The official investigation of 1887 reached no definitive conclusion. Her remains were never found, despite an exhaustive search of the property and surrounding woods. The case was eventually closed, with her fate listed as unknown. A peculiar detail emerged during the investigation that received little official attention but has fascinated subsequent researchers. In the barn, which had largely collapsed by 1887, investigators discovered a large glass tank, shattered but recognizable in form. The tank, approximately 7 feet long, 3 feet wide, and 4 feet deep, appeared to have been custom-made, as no commercial manufacturers of the time produced such items. Fragments of glass found at the site were unusually thick, over an inch in some pieces, suggesting it was designed to withstand significant pressure. Around the remnants of this tank, the soil was saturated with what chemical analysis identified as a complex solution containing formaldehyde, alcohol, and several unidentifiable organic compounds. The concentration was such that even 22 years after Ruthie Mae's disappearance, the ground remained largely sterile, with no vegetation growing in the immediate vicinity. However, in 1912, during construction of a new county road near the former Dunlap property, workers uncovered a peculiar structure buried approximately 6 feet below ground level. Described in the foreman's report as a circular stone chamber, roughly 8 feet in diameter, it contained what appeared to be laboratory equipment, glass tubing, ceramic containers, and metal instruments of unknown purpose, all arranged around a central stone table with channels carved into its surface. The discovery was documented and then quickly reburied on the orders of the county commissioner, who cited public safety concerns as the reason. No photographs were taken, but sketches made by one of the workers show a configuration reminiscent of early embalming facilities, though with modifications that defy easy explanation. The sketch also depicts what appears to be a drainage system leading from the central table to a series of glass containers arranged in a circular pattern around the perimeter of the chamber. One worker, who later gave an anonymous interview to a local newspaper, described finding a leather-bound book within the chamber. Before the site was reburied, he managed to examine several pages which contained drawings of human anatomy unlike any medical text I've seen, as if depicting the body from the inside out, with the organs and vessels transformed into something different. The book was allegedly confiscated by county officials and never publicly acknowledged in official records. In the decades that followed, the story of Ruthie Mae Dunlap faded once again from public memory. The land where her homestead once stood was eventually incorporated into a larger cattle ranch. No structures remain to mark her presence, and most local histories mention her only in passing, if at all. Occasionally, however, unusual incidents would revive local interest in the legend. In 1927, a cattle rancher reported that several of his animals found dead near the former Dunlap property exhibited strange preservation characteristics. Their bodies remained intact without signs of decomposition for weeks after death, despite exposure to the elements. A local veterinarian who examined the carcasses noted in his records that the animal's blood appeared to have been replaced by a clear, viscous fluid of unknown composition. It was not until 1952, when historian Margaret Fletcher began researching women scientists of the 19th century, that academic interest in the case revived. Fletcher's investigations led her to the archived materials from the 1887 and 1912 discoveries. Her requests to examine the preserved specimens were denied, with university officials claiming they had been disposed of due to deterioration. Similarly, county records related to the buried laboratory had apparently been lost during an office relocation in the 1920s. Fletcher's correspondence reveals growing frustration with the obstacles she encountered. In a letter to a colleague dated June 1953, she wrote, "At every turn, I find records missing, witnesses reluctant to speak, and officials unwilling to grant access to relevant materials. It is difficult to avoid the conclusion that some concerted effort has been made to obscure the true nature and extent of Ruthie Mae Dunlap's work." Undeterred, Fletcher sought out elderly residents of the area who might recall stories passed down about Ruthie Mae. What she found was a community still reluctant to discuss the matter, even nearly 90 years later. One elderly woman who requested anonymity told Fletcher that her grandmother had once encountered Ruthie Mae on the road at dusk and had been disturbed by the way her shadow moved differently than she did, as if it were trying to separate itself. Another local resident shared a story about his grandfather, who had participated in the 1887 investigation. According to family lore, the grandfather had returned home from the Dunlap property, white-faced and trembling, refused to eat for 3 days, and thereafter would never discuss what he had seen. He reportedly insisted on sleeping with a lamp lit until his death in 1903, and would become agitated at the sight of glass jars or containers. According to Hillard, his great-uncle claimed that, while examining the chamber, he had seen something moving in one of the glass containers, not like an animal or insect, but like liquid taking on a purposeful shape. The great-uncle reportedly suffered from recurring nightmares for years afterward, in which glass things filled with clear fluid spoke to him in a woman's voice. Fletcher's research culminated in a monograph titled The Scientific Endeavors of Ruthie Mae Dunlap, submitted to the Historical Society of Missouri in 1954. A particularly unsettling account came from Thomas Hillard, whose great-uncle had been among the road workers who discovered the underground chamber in 1912. The document was never published. According to correspondence in Fletcher's personal papers, the Society returned her manuscript with a terse note stating that it failed to meet academic standards of evidence. Fletcher's subsequent letters reveal increasing frustration and a growing conviction that her work was being deliberately suppressed. In a final letter to a colleague dated March 1955, she wrote, "I have come to believe that the true nature of Ruthie Mae's work is known to certain parties who prefer it remain buried. My investigations have attracted unwelcome attention. I am relocating to continue my research privately." No further correspondence from Fletcher exists in any accessible archive. A brief obituary in a Kansas City newspaper in 1968 mentions only that she died after a lengthy illness. During her research, Fletcher had attempted to trace Ruthie Mae's background before her arrival in the Ozarks. She discovered fragmentary evidence suggesting that Ruthie Mae had studied at a medical institution in Vienna in the 1850s, possibly under an assumed name. Records indicated that a female student matching Ruthie Mae's description had been expelled for conducting unauthorized experiments related to the preservation of living tissue outside the body. This student had reportedly developed theories about the chemical basis of consciousness that her instructors found philosophically troubling and scientifically unsound. The trail might have ended there, were it not for an unusual real estate listing that appeared in 1963. The cattle ranch encompassing the former Dunlap property was put up for sale following the owner's death. The listing described the property in standard terms, but included a peculiar covenant. A small section of the land, approximately 1 acre, was to remain undeveloped and undisturbed in perpetuity. The exact location corresponded to where Ruthie Mae's house had once stood. When questioned by a potential buyer, the executor of the estate claimed the covenant had been established decades earlier and could not be removed. He offered no explanation for its purpose. Land surveys conducted as part of the sale process revealed anomalous soil composition in the restricted area, unusually high in certain minerals and organic compounds that suggested extensive chemical saturation at some point in the past. More curiously, the survey noted that ground-penetrating radar showed inconsistent results when used in the restricted area, with readings suggesting cavity structures that would change configuration between successive scans. The surveyor's report concluded that the equipment must have been malfunctioning, though it worked perfectly well in all other areas tested. The property changed hands multiple times over the following years, but the covenant remained in force. Local folklore gradually transformed Ruthie Mae from a historical figure into something more akin to a cautionary tale. Parents in the region reportedly warned unruly children that old Ruthie Mae will get you if you wander too far into the woods. The specific details of her story became increasingly distorted, with supernatural elements incorporated that had no basis in the historical record. Yet, beneath these folk embellishments, a persistent core of unease remained regarding the actual historical events. Several owners of the property reported unusual phenomena in or near the restricted area. Animals refused to enter it. Electronic equipment would malfunction. Visitors would experience inexplicable sensations, dizziness, auditory hallucinations, or what one described as the feeling of being observed from all directions simultaneously. In 1967, a graduate student in chemistry from the University of Arkansas became interested in the case after finding references to Ruthie Mae's preservation techniques in Fletcher's unpublished papers, which had been donated to the university library after her death. The student, Robert Kincaid, noted that the chemical formulations described in the fragmentary journal entries were remarkably sophisticated for their time and potentially represented a significant lost innovation in the field of biological preservation. Kincaid's academic advisor initially discouraged his interest, suggesting that the historical evidence was too fragmentary to be of scientific value. Undeterred, Kincaid began attempting to recreate some of the simpler formulations described in Ruthie Mae's notes. His laboratory journal, later obtained through a Freedom of Information request, documents a series of increasingly successful experiments preserving tissue samples using modified versions of her techniques. A crucial breakthrough came when Kincaid identified a key component of Ruthie Mae's preservation medium, a compound derived from certain fungi found in cave systems throughout the Ozarks. This compound, when properly processed and combined with more conventional preservatives, produced a solution with remarkable properties. Tissue samples immersed in it not only resisted decomposition, but maintained cellular integrity far longer than was possible with standard methods. More unsettling were Kincaid's observations about the preserved tissue's response to electrical stimulation. In one experiment, muscle tissue preserved in the solution for over 30 days exhibited contractile responses indistinguishable from those of freshly harvested tissue. Neural tissue showed even more remarkable properties, with cellular activity detectable weeks after preservation began. Kincaid's work was abruptly discontinued following what university records cryptically referred to as an incident in the laboratory. Former colleagues, interviewed decades later, described finding Kincaid alone in the lab late one night, surrounded by containers of his experimental preservation medium. According to these accounts, he appeared to be in a state of extreme agitation, claiming that he had observed movement in tissue samples that had been preserved for over 2 months, movement that occurred without any external stimulation. University records indicate that Kincaid was hospitalized briefly for nervous exhaustion and subsequently withdrew from the program. He abandoned chemistry entirely and, according to former classmates, moved to Alaska, where he reportedly lived in isolation until his death in 1994. His research notes were confiscated by the university and sealed under a confidentiality agreement with the federal government, ostensibly due to potential national security implications. The restricted area of the former Dunlap property has, over the years, developed a reputation for unusual phenomena. Local residents report electronic devices malfunctioning in its vicinity. Vegetation grows abnormally dense along its perimeter, but is strangely absent within its boundaries, despite no obvious difference in soil or sunlight. Wildlife reportedly avoid the area entirely. Particularly noteworthy is the behavior of water in the vicinity. Despite being downhill from surrounding terrain, the restricted area remains unusually dry even during heavy rains. A geological survey conducted in 1975 found that groundwater appears to flow around rather than through the area, as if diverted by some unseen force. The survey team reported that water samples taken from nearby Blackwell Creek contained trace amounts of organic compounds that bear some resemblance to preservatives used in laboratory settings, though with molecular structures not previously cataloged. In 1968, the last comprehensive study of the Ruthie Mae Dunlap case was attempted by journalist Howard Teller. His investigation took him through the various archives and local historical societies that contained fragments of the story. Teller's notes, now held in the collection of the State Historical Society of Missouri, reveal an increasingly paranoid state of mind as his research progressed. Initially skeptical of the more lurid aspects of the legend, Teller's notes show a gradual shift in perspective as he uncovered more documentation. Of particular interest was his discovery of a previously unknown account from Joseph Miller, the delivery man who had first found the Dunlap property abandoned in 1865. In a private letter written to his sister in 1878, Miller admitted that he had not been entirely truthful in his official statement. According to this letter, Miller had indeed entered the barn after finding the house empty. Inside, he discovered what he described as a scene beyond rational explanation. The barn had been converted into a laboratory with glass tubing connecting various vessels filled with clear fluids. In the center stood a large glass tank, similar to the one partially unearthed in 1887. Miller's letter states, "What I beheld in that tank haunts me still. It appeared to be a human form, suspended in clear fluid, yet it was not fully human as we understand the term. The features were those of a woman. Indeed, I believe it to have been Miss Dunlap herself, but the body was altered in ways I cannot adequately describe. The skin had taken on a translucent quality, and within I could discern movement as of fluid circulating through vessels not arranged as they ought to be in a human body." Most disturbing was Miller's claim that as he stood transfixed by this sight, the eyes of the thing in the tank opened and regarded me with undeniable recognition and awareness. He fled immediately and never returned to the property. His official statement had omitted these details out of fear that I would be thought mad, or worse, somehow complicit in whatever unholy work had been conducted there. Teller's notes also reference a series of interviews with local residents who claimed that over the decades there had been occasional sightings of a figure near the restricted area, a tall woman in outdated dress, her features indistinct as if viewed through water. These sightings, while infrequent, spanned from the 1880s to as recently as 1965, always at a distance, and typically at dusk or dawn. His final entry, dated September 17, 1968, reads, "The pattern is clear now. Every attempt to fully investigate this matter has been thwarted, the investigators silenced or discredited. I believe Ruthie Mae discovered something fundamental about the nature of preservation that extends beyond mere physical matter, a method of sustaining consciousness within a medium that neither lives nor dies as we understand these states. The implications are staggering. I've arranged for these notes to be delivered to the Historical Society in the event that I am similarly redirected." Teller's article was never published. According to public records, he died of a heart attack in his home 2 days after writing that final note, at the age of 37, with no prior history of cardiac issues. His collected research materials arrived at the Historical Society as he had arranged, but certain key documents he referenced in his notes were reportedly missing from the collection, including Miller's letter and several photographs Teller had taken of the restricted area. And so the case remains, a fragmented mystery spanning more than a century, with each attempt to uncover the truth seemingly ending in obstruction or tragedy. What actually happened to Ruthie Mae Dunlap in those autumn days of 1865? What was the nature of her research, and did she achieve the breakthrough she mentioned in her final journal entry? The most disturbing theory, first suggested in Fletcher's unpublished monograph and elaborated upon in Teller's notes, is that Ruthie Mae did not disappear at all, at least not in the conventional sense. Both researchers pointed to the absence of a body, the continuing anomalous properties of the site, and the persistent efforts to suppress investigation as evidence that whatever Ruthie Mae discovered about preservation might have had implications far beyond conventional understanding. As Fletcher wrote in a passage that was struck from her manuscript, we must consider the possibility that Ruthie Mae Dunlap achieved precisely what her research aimed for, a form of preservation so complete and profound that it transcends our normal conception of existence. The question then becomes not where she went, but what she became. A small but significant piece of evidence supporting this theory emerged in 1979, when construction workers digging a new well on a neighboring property uncovered a sealed glass container approximately 3 feet in length. Inside was what appeared to be a human arm, preserved in a clear solution. The most remarkable aspect, noted by the medical examiner who briefly investigated before the container was confiscated by federal authorities, was that the tissue showed no signs of decomposition despite its age, and the fingernails displayed evidence of continued growth after preservation began. The container bore a label with a sequence of numbers and the initials RMD. It was reportedly transported to a government facility for further study, but no official report on the findings has ever been released. The workers who discovered it were required to sign non-disclosure agreements, and the incident does not appear in any public records. In 1985, a group of biology students conducting an environmental survey of the region collected water samples from various locations, including Blackwell Creek near the former Dunlap property. Laboratory analysis revealed that samples from this location contained microscopic organisms with highly unusual characteristics. The organisms, while appearing to be simple single-celled life forms, displayed complex behaviors typically associated with more advanced species. More significantly, these organisms proved remarkably resistant to conditions that would destroy normal cells. They survived extremes of temperature, radiation exposure, and chemical treatments that would be lethal to any known form of life. The research team's report suggested that these organisms might represent an entirely novel branch of the evolutionary tree, or possibly an engineered life form with unprecedented survival capabilities. The team's findings were never published in peer-reviewed journals. The lead researcher reportedly accepted a position with a government laboratory and ceased all communication with former colleagues. The samples were confiscated, and the university laboratory where they had been studied was closed for renovations that extended for over a year. Today, the former Dunlap property remains private land, the restrictive covenant still in force despite multiple legal challenges by subsequent owners. Satellite imagery shows the restricted area as an almost perfectly circular clearing amidst the surrounding forest, a persistent anomaly in the landscape that defies natural explanation. Those few academics who still express interest in the case tend to focus narrowly on Ruthie Mae's potential contributions to 19th century women's scientific history, carefully avoiding the more unsettling implications of her work. Local residents, when asked about Ruthie Mae Dunlap, typically respond with uncomfortable silence or deflection. In 2002, a documentary filmmaker attempted to create a feature about the case, conducting interviews with historians and local residents. The project was abandoned after the filmmaker reported experiencing technical difficulties whenever filming near the restricted area, with equipment failing and footage becoming corrupted. More disturbingly, several interview subjects later denied having participated, despite signed release forms and preliminary transcripts of their statements. The filmmaker herself suffered what was described as a psychological episode during post-production, reportedly becoming convinced that she was being watched by something that existed between states of matter. She was briefly hospitalized and subsequently abandoned filmmaking entirely. The partial footage and research materials she had compiled were destroyed in what authorities ruled an accidental fire at her home office. Perhaps the most telling detail comes from county water testing records. Every few years, state environmental agencies test the water quality in Blackwell Creek, which still runs along what was once the edge of the Dunlap property. The results consistently show trace amounts of chemical compounds that cannot be readily identified, preservatives of unknown composition that have persisted in the ecosystem for over 150 years. Analysis conducted in 2015 using advanced spectrographic techniques revealed that these compounds have a molecular structure unlike any known preservative, with unusual stability and resistance to degradation. More alarming was the discovery that these compounds appear to be slowly increasing in concentration over time, as if some source continues to leach them into the groundwater. A soil sample taken from the edge of the restricted area in 2018, as part of a routine environmental assessment, yielded another unsettling discovery. The sample contained microscopic glass fragments with a composition matching that of laboratory glassware from the mid-19th century. Embedded within these fragments were cellular structures that, according to the analyzing laboratory, appear to be biological in origin but do not correspond to any known plant or animal tissue. The report noted that these cellular structures, despite their age, showed evidence of metabolic processes not entirely consistent with either living or dead tissue, a state that the report described as metabolically indeterminate. The findings were filed away in environmental records with no further investigation ordered. Whatever Ruthie Mae Dunlap discovered in those isolated Ozark hills, whatever became of her and her work, one thing seems certain: some part of her research continues to exert influence even now. As Howard Teller wrote in his final notes, the most terrifying possibility is not that Ruthie Mae Dunlap disappeared, but that she succeeded. That she remains watching, preserved in some state beyond our comprehension, as each new investigator approaches the truth, only to be turned away or silenced. In 2010, an elderly man contacted the State Historical Society, claiming to be a distant relative of Ruthie Mae Dunlap. He offered to donate a small wooden box that had been passed down through his family for generations, allegedly containing items belonging to Ruthie Mae. When the curator arrived to collect the donation, she found the man's house empty, with no sign of forced entry or struggle. The man himself was never found. The box, however, was sitting on the kitchen table. Inside were several items: a locket containing a lock of dark hair, a small journal with most pages torn out, and a glass vial of clear liquid sealed with wax. The few remaining journal pages contained fragmentary notes on chemical formulations and a recurring phrase, "The body is merely a vessel. What matters is the essence." The vial was sent to a university laboratory for analysis. The researchers reported that the liquid appeared to be a complex organic compound, unlike anything in current scientific literature. Most unsettling was their observation that the liquid exhibited slight but measurable movement, even when the vial was perfectly still. Microscopic currents and patterns that one researcher described as almost purposeful in nature. Before further tests could be conducted, the vial disappeared from the laboratory. Security footage showed no one entering or leaving the room where it was stored. The lead researcher resigned from her position shortly thereafter, citing personal reasons. In a private email to a colleague, later leaked online, she wrote, "I dreamed of her last night. She was floating in glass watching me. She knows what we found." Local legends surrounding the Dunlap property have persisted into the present day. Hikers and hunters report disorientation when passing near the restricted area, with compasses spinning erratically and GPS devices showing impossible coordinates. Several people have reported experiencing lost time, entering the woods near the property in morning light, only to emerge at dusk with no memory of the intervening hours. A park ranger patrolling the national forest that now borders the private land containing the Dunlap property filed an unusual incident report in 2017. He described observing what appeared to be a column of mist or vapor rising from the restricted area around dawn. The column, he reported, maintained its shape against the wind and appeared to contain refractive properties, bending light that passed through it. When he attempted to approach for a closer look, he experienced sudden and extreme disorientation, finding himself nearly a mile away with no recollection of how he had traveled there. The ranger's report was subsequently removed from official records. When questioned by interested parties through Freedom of Information requests, the Forest Service claimed no knowledge of the incident or the ranger, despite pay records confirming his employment during that period. In 2019, a graduate student in environmental science installed several remote cameras around the perimeter of the restricted area as part of a wildlife study. The cameras were designed to activate when detecting motion or heat signatures. After 2 weeks, the student returned to collect the data, only to find that while the cameras had triggered numerous times, the resulting images showed nothing but the empty forest. In several cases, cameras facing the restricted area had captured images of wildlife approaching the perimeter. and then abruptly turning away, as if encountering an invisible barrier. Most curious were a series of images captured at exactly 3:17 a.m. on 3 consecutive nights. Each showed what appeared to be a diffuse light source moving among the trees with no apparent physical form. The final night's images showed the light approaching one of the cameras directly before the device malfunctioned permanently. The student's academic advisor recommended abandoning that particular research site, citing concerns about equipment reliability. The student, however, became increasingly obsessed with the anomalies, eventually taking a leave of absence to conduct independent research on the history of the property. University records indicate that the student never returned to complete their degree and, according to concerned family members, relocated to an undisclosed location after claiming to have made contact with something that shouldn't exist. In 2021, during an exceptionally severe drought, similar to the one that had exposed the first stone chamber in 1887, Blackwell Creek once again receded to unprecedented levels. A local photographer documenting the environmental impact of the drought captured images of what appeared to be glass structures protruding from the creek bed near the Dunlap property. Before these structures could be examined, a sudden localized rainstorm, described by witnesses as appearing out of nowhere on a clear day, raised the water levels again, concealing whatever had been partially exposed. The photographer later reported that all images of the glass structures had become corrupted in their digital storage, appearing as nothing but indecipherable static. Shortly afterward, the photographer developed an unusual skin condition on their hands and forearms, a network of fine, transparent vessels just beneath the skin that medical professionals could neither identify nor treat effectively. The restricted area remains undisturbed. The anomalous clearing persists. And occasionally, according to those who live nearest the old property, on particularly still nights when the moon is dark, a faint sound can be heard emanating from the direction of where the Dunlap house once stood. What one resident described as the sound of glass being carefully arranged over and over again. Another resident, speaking on condition of anonymity, claimed that during a period of personal crisis, they had ventured close to the restricted area in the early hours of the morning. Standing at the perimeter, they had experienced what they described as a presence emerging from the darkness, not visually, but as a pressure in my mind. This presence, they claimed, had communicated a single message: preservation is transformation. The resident reported that following this experience, they found themselves strangely revitalized, with chronic health issues mysteriously resolved. However, they also noted unsettling changes, their reflection sometimes seeming to move independently of them, and dreams filled with endless corridors of glass containers, each holding something that watches me pass. A meteorological oddity noted by several scientific studies but never explained is that the restricted area experiences significantly fewer lightning strikes than statistically expected for its location and terrain. Weather tracking data from the past 50 years shows a clear pattern. Electrical storms appear to divert around the area, as if repelled by some unseen influence. Geological surveys conducted in 2022 using advanced scanning techniques revealed another anomaly. Beneath the restricted area, at a depth of approximately 30 feet, is what appears to be a network of chambers that do not match any known natural cave formation. Attempts to investigate these chambers using ground-penetrating radar have produced inconsistent results, with the configuration appearing to shift between successive scans. The current owner of the property, a corporate entity registered in Delaware with no public-facing officers, has denied all requests for access to the restricted area for scientific investigation. Legal documents related to the property's ownership are sealed under unusual confidentiality agreements that multiple attorneys have described as unprecedented in real estate law. What remains of Ruthie Mae Dunlap's legacy? Is it merely a historical curiosity, a case study in how a woman scientist's work could be overlooked and mythologized in the 19th century? Or is there something more, something that continues to exist in some liminal state between conventional definitions of life and death? The evidence, fragmentary as it is, suggests that Ruthie Mae may have discovered something profound about the nature of biological preservation, not merely the suspension of decay, but the transformation of living matter into something else entirely, something that retains aspects of consciousness or awareness outside the normal parameters of existence. If so, the true horror of the Ruthie Mae Dunlap case may not be what happened in 1865, but what continues to happen now, a presence that persists, watches, and occasionally reaches out from behind the thin glass membrane separating its preserved state from our world. Those who have studied the case most deeply often reach the same disturbing conclusion, that Ruthie Mae Dunlap did not die or disappear in the conventional sense. Rather, she transformed herself through her own experimental techniques into something beyond conventional human understanding, neither fully alive nor truly dead, but preserved in a state of perpetual conscious suspension. As Margaret Fletcher wrote in her private notes, never published, but preserved in university archives, the most unsettling possibility is not that Ruthie Mae failed and died, but that she succeeded and persists, watching from glass eyes that never close, waiting for someone to understand what she became and, perhaps, to join her. The restricted area remains undisturbed, the covenant unbroken. The circular clearing persists amidst the forest, a place where nothing grows and nothing dies. And somewhere, perhaps in the underground chambers, perhaps in the waters of Blackwell Creek, perhaps in some state that defies conventional description, something that was once Ruthie Mae Dunlap continues its patient existence, preserved beyond time, transformed beyond recognition, waiting for the next curious investigator to approach the truth.